Hello. Well, that's the Christmas decorations finished. That's my job every year, see? Decorate a Christmas tree, he says. God blimey, don't they little pines stick in your fingers too? Funny idea, bringing a tree in your house, innit? And then hanging all they decorations on it. I bet that little angel up on the top can tell a story, mine. In fact, I suppose he was just about the start of it all. Nearly 2,000 years ago, that was. Because about that time, see, there was this here chap called Joseph. Used to live in a little place called Nazareth. That's a little town in Palestine, see. Well, this here Joseph was quite an ordinary sort of bloke, no different to you or I. Matter of fact, he was a chippy. Did a bit of woodwork, you know. In fact, he probably had his own little business there, because Nazareth was well known for his carpentry and joinery, see? And he used to get up in the morning and go off to work just like you or I. And like most young chaps, he was planning his future and looking forward to getting married and settling down to raise a family and that. In fact, he was already engaged to a young woman called Mary. Of course, I expect they was already engaged when they was all young kids like, long before they ever had any ideas of getting married. I mean, that was a Jewish custom in they days, look. Well, 'tis in some parts of the world today, innit? Anyhow, one day, young Mary was tidying round the room like at home, just flipping around with a duster and that, and humming a little tune to herself, when all of a sudden, she stopped dead in her tracks. She had a funny sort of feeling that somebody else was in the room. And she turned and she looked round, and there, on the other side of the room, was an angel. Mind, this wasn't no ordinary angel. Oh, no. No, he was an archangel. Gabriel, his name was, or sort of real top-notcher. And he could see that Mary was lost for words like for a minute. Mary, he said, nice and quiet like, don't be frightened, my dear, 'cause there ain't nothing to be afraid of. In fact, you're a very highly favoured girl. Do you know you've been chosen by God for something very special? Well, poor old Mary, she didn't know what to say. She dropped her duster and she just stood there with her mouth open like. And old Gabriel went on to explain to her how she'd have a little baby boy and that she would call his name Jesus, and that when he grew up, he'd be a great man. Now, it's a strange thing, look, but Mary wasn't all that frightened. Well, not so much frightened as puzzled. And she looked up into the old archangel's face and she said, I don't understand how that can possibly happen. I'm not married. I'm still a virgin. And old Gabriel looked down at her and he smiled. Mary, he said, shaking his head, don't you worry about that. Don't you give it another thought, look. 'Cause some things ain't got no earthly explanation. One day you'll understand. This won't be your doing, my dear. This won't be no reflection on you at all. 'Cause this is God's doing. In fact, the little baby will be called the Son of God. And Mary's eyes lit up. Well, I was a bit worried for a minute, she said. But now that you've explained, well, I think I understand. But I bet for the life of her, she couldn't have explained why. But she accepted it as though it was the most natural thing in the world. But yeah, what about old Joseph, though? I don't suppose he was going to be very happy about all this, do you? Well, Mary didn't say a word to him about her little chat with Gabriel and about the baby and that. But of course, after a while he began to suspect, didn't he? And he just couldn't make it out at all. And he went to bed that night a very worried man. He tossed and he turned, trying to decide just how to tackle Mary. And eventually he must have dozed off. And when he woke up, just like Mary, everything was clear to him. He couldn't explain why, but he knew just what had happened. I suppose that is the clever way in which God to work, see? When perhaps we've gone to bed with a particular worrying problem, we do twist and turn and don't get a lot of sleep, do we? In fact, we might even dream about it. Well, that's how it was with Joseph. He must have had a dream. Mine, it was all a bit vague when he woke up, but he could remember one thing quite clearly, and that was a voice telling him not to be afraid to make Mary his wife. Well, it was like a great weight off his mind, wasn't it? So he took an hour off work that morning, and as soon as he'd had his breakfast, he went straight along to see Mary. And they made their minds up there and then to get married just as soon as they could. Of course, in the meantime, see, that old Archangel Gabriel hadn't been hanging about. And as it turned out, young Mary wasn't the only one with a bit of good news. But I'm jumping the gun there a little bit, see. Mary had a cousin called Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's husband was a priest by the name of Zachariah. Now, they was both getting on a bit, and they had no children, although they dearly have loved to have had one. But Elizabeth was barren, see. She couldn't have children. And one day, old Zachariah was taking part in a service at the temple. Part of his job, see, was to offer incense in a little part of the temple away from the congregation. And suddenly, there was the old Archangel Gabriel stood by the side of the altar. Well, poor old Zachariah, he was frightened to death. Well, I mean, he had never seen an angel before, had he? But old Gabriel was used to this lot. And he said to him, "Now, don't upset yourself, Zachariah. Look, there ain't nothing to be afraid of. I just come down to tell you that your dearest wish is going to come true. Because you and Elizabeth will have a little baby boy. And you'll call him John. And when he grows up, he'll go on his way converting people and preparing them for the coming of Jesus." Of course, that was John the Baptist, look. But old Zachariah was a bit sceptical about this. He couldn't quite believe it, see, because, well, Elizabeth was so old. Now, Gabriel, he got very sharp with him. He said, "Hey, now hang about, mister. You just listen to me. You're talking to Gabriel, and I've been sent down by God to give you this news. And 'cause you don't believe me, I'm going to take away your power of speech until such time as my words is proved true." And that's what happened, see? Poor old Zachariah, he got struck dumb there and then, and he never said another word until after the baby was born. Now, it was just after the Archangel Gabriel had put old Zachariah in his place that Mary decided to call and see Elizabeth and tell her the good news. Got all excited, see? Wow, just like any other young girl of today expecting her first baby. She wants to go and tell her close friends, don't she? Her relatives, have a little chat about it. But now, here's a strange thing, look. Up until then, Mary hadn't said a word to nobody about the baby. Nobody didn't know. But as she was coming out the road, Elizabeth looked out of her window and seen her, and she run out the house and she run down the road to meet her, and Elizabeth greeted her in a very strange way. "Hail, Mary," she said, "God's blessing is on you above all women, and his blessing is on the fruit of thy womb." And that's where we gets the prayer, see? "Hail, Mary, full of grace, blessed art thou among women." Well, now, that was a funny thing to say, wasn't it? I mean, when she hadn't even been told that Mary was expecting. But Mary didn't pay no attention to it at all. I mean, you or I would have said, "Hey, how do you know then?" But not Mary. No, she was getting used to the way that God did work, see? And Elizabeth found out a bit about that too later on when her own baby was born. Because all the neighbours, see, fully expected him to be called Zachariah, after his father. But Elizabeth said, no, he's going to be called John. Well, of course, the neighbours had never heard of nobody called John, so they turned round to old Zachariah and they made signs to him and asked him what he wanted the baby to be called. And old Zachariah, he cocked hold of a writing block, or whatever it was they used to use, and he wrote down the name John. And suddenly, from that very second, he was able to speak again. So old Gabriel's words had come true in the end, see? And somehow Elizabeth knew. She knew that Mary's child would be somebody special, and that her own son would be the one to go ahead and prepare the way for him and tell people all about Jesus. Because if you remember, look, nearly 700 years before that, the old prophet Isaiah said that one day there would be a voice crying from the wilderness. And John was to live out in the wilderness, see? That's the dry desert country, just outside Jerusalem, by the side of the River Jordan. And he preached to people all about Jesus, and later he was to baptize Jesus. That's how he got the name John the Baptist. But of course, that was looking a long way ahead, wasn't it? some months after Mary had been over to see her cousin Elizabeth, her own time was getting a bit near. Now, in they days, the country was occupied by the Romans, look, and every now and again, they used to have a little census. Well, I suppose the Romans was conquering people left, right and centre, see? And the old Emperor Augustus, well, he couldn't keep pace with them. So every so often he used to say, "Aye, now hold your horses, look. Let's have a little census. Let's see what the score is." Now, they didn't go about it like we do nowadays, you know, fill in one of they great big buff forms and that. No, they used to make everybody go back to their own town and register. Back to the town of their ancestors. Funny way of going about it, wasn't it? Anyhow, that's what they used to do. So poor old Joseph and Mary, they had to make this long journey back to Bethlehem. About 100 miles it was. And it was hard going too. It was a hard, rough journey. I mean, they couldn't go downtown and jump on a number 2 bus like you or I can, or go down and catch a train. No, they had to travel by mule or donkey. Now then, you just imagine being on the back of a donkey, travelling 100 miles over rough roads. 'Cause even the Roman engineers ain't got round to making decent roads yet, look. And Mary, remember what her condition was? And they had to go over hills and across dusty plains, and, well, they must have been just about wore out when they got her. And poor old Joseph, he could see that Mary was dead tired. So he started looking round for somewhere for him to go and spend the night. Course, I mean, the place was packed, wasn't it? Packed out with visitors coming to answer the census. There was people everywhere. God, what a job he had. He tried every place he could, but no, nobody didn't want to know. Oh, there was a few that would have liked to have helped out if they'd had the room, but they was all full up. And there was a few others, mind, that could have helped, but didn't want to know when they saw Mary's condition. They was more concerned with not having their other guests disturbed if anything was to happen during the night, see, and they had to get out and fetch a doctor and start boiling water and that. There's still a few of they around today, mind. But I wonder if they'd have turned their backs if they'd known just who it was going to be born that night. Anyhow, poor old Joseph, he was beginning to get a bit desperate. Well, I mean, even the main inn had no room for him. Till in the end, look, somebody suggested, "Look, there's a stable just round about, my old son. Go and nip in there." That's where they ended up, see, in along with the animals. But at least it was somewhere warm and dry for them, wasn't it? Where they could go and rest their weary bodies. And somehow, it was a strange, friendly atmosphere in the stable that night. They sort of felt protected by the animals. In the days of King Herod, astrologers was very important people. Now, everybody took a lot of notice of what they said. In fact, they was looked upon as wise men. And about the time that Jesus was born, some of these astrologer chaps turned up in Jerusalem, which is about 6 miles to the north of Bethlehem. And they started asking where the child was, see? The child who was to be born the King of the Jews. Well, 1 or 2 people looked at him a bit sideways, as much as to say, whatever it's on about. But of course, they didn't dare say so in as many words. Anyhow, these astrologer blokes could see that they was a bit puzzled. So they explained about this big star that they'd seen rising in the east. And being the wise men that they was, they said that this was a sign that this great king had been born. Now, old King Herod got to hear about this, and he was a little bit put out about it, I don't mind telling you. A nasty old devil he was. I mean, he didn't want no king coming along and messing things up for him, did he? So he got together all his chief priests and his lawyers and all that, and he started asking them, where is this new Messiah going to be born to? In Bethlehem, they said, in Judea. And they told him all about this old prophecy, which read, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, you are far from least in the eyes of the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a leader to be the shepherd of all my people Israel. Well, of course, old Herod didn't like the sound of this a bit, did he? But he was dead crafty with it, mind. Oh, nasty piece of work he was. And he didn't let on, see. Oh, no. He thought to himself, if I plays me cards right, look, I can get rid of this here so-called king and keep things right for myself. So he called all these astrologer blokes together again, see, to ask them where they'd seen this star. And then he sent them on to Bethlehem. Go and find out all about this child, he said. And when you knows where he is, come and let me know so's I can go and pay homage to him myself. Crafty old devil. So off they went, see, and they followed this here bright star until it stopped right over the stable where Mary and Joseph had settled down for the night. Of course, being wise men, see, they could see through old King Herod. They knew just what he was up to, and they had no intentions at all of going back and telling him where the baby was born. No, they dodged the altogether, see, and eventually they went home another way round. Now, while all this was going on, look, another strange event was taking place just outside of Bethlehem, up in the hills. Now, the country around Bethlehem is pretty well uncultivated. Well, they used to grow a few grapes and olives and that, but in the main, the occupation was rearing sheep and goats. Of course, the land was a bit bare, see, sort of moorland-like. There wasn't no fencing or that, so it was pretty well a full-time job looking after these sheep and making sure that the jackals and the hyenas didn't get after them, see. Now, on this particular night, some of the shepherds were sat round having a chat, see, and keeping their eye on their sheep, when all of a sudden, the whole place seemed to light up, and there in front of them was an angel. Oh, well, they was absolutely petrified. I mean, they was only simple peasants, look, weren't they? And they had never seen nothing like this before. But the angel said, now, don't you be afraid, look. There ain't no need for that at all, because I've been and brought you all some very good news. And he went on to tell them, see, all about the birth of Jesus down in Bethlehem, and how they'd find him lying in a manger in a stable down there. And with that, the whole heap of angels appeared, and they were singing, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men." I suppose you might call that the first Christmas carol ever, see. Now, when the angels had left them, the shepherds looked at one another as though they could hardly believe what had happened, until one of them said, "Well, come on then, don't hang about, let's get down there. Let's get straight down to Bethlehem and see for ourselves this amazing thing what the angels have told us about." And they grabbed their sticks and a few belongings, and off they went. Never mind about the sheep and the goats, they'd have to look after themselves that night. All they wanted to do was to get down into Bethlehem and see this little baby, this Messiah that the angels had told them all about. And when they got into Bethlehem, they started to tell everybody all about this here angel that they'd seen and what he'd said to them. Well, people was quite amazed at the story, and they looked at him a bit cockle-like, see? But eventually, they found their stable, and in it, they found Mary and Joseph and the manger, and a little baby Jesus in it. Of course, to any outsider looking in, see, it was just an ordinary baby. But when Mary heard the shepherd's story, she was pleased, and she thought back to the day when she'd first seen old Gabriel, and she knew then that everything that he'd said was coming true. And she just sat there rocking her little baby, surrounded by all the animals and the shepherds. And that's where it all began, see? Just a few people gathered round who realized that something big had happened. Suddenly, God had stepped down into history.